The smoke clears, revealing two men standing 20 paces apart on a dusty street. Their hands hover over their holstered revolvers. A tumbleweed rolls by. The clock strikes noon. Then, faster than the eye can follow, one man draws and fires. The other crumples to the ground. This scene, replayed in countless Western films, is perhaps the most enduring image of the American frontier. It is also almost entirely fiction. The real Wild West, that lawless expanse of territories stretching from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast between roughly 1850 and 1900, was far stranger, more chaotic, and infinitely more brutal than Hollywood ever dared to show. The genuine stories of its most famous gunfighters are so bizarre, so darkly comedic, and so tragic that they make the sanitized movie versions look like children's fairy tales. This is the story of how America's national myth was born from blood, lies, and spectacular PR campaigns. It is about sheriffs who were worse than the outlaws they chased, weapons that barely worked, and heroes who were destroyed by their own invented legends. In 1886, the residents of Coolidge, Kansas, placed an advertisement in a newspaper called the Border Ruffian, a name that perfectly captured the spirit of frontier journalism. The ad read, "Wanted, for the position of sheriff, a man with the hide of a rhinoceros, a bulletproof head, capable of seeing all around himself, able to run faster than a horse, fearing nothing in hell or Coolidge, a man who can shoot accurately and who would rather shoot 4 or 5 drunk troublemakers before breakfast than sit down to eat without such morning exercise." The job posting was written half in jest, but the truth behind it was deadly serious. Being a lawman on the frontier was a suicide mission. In Texas alone, between 1869 and 1878, bandits killed approximately 100 sheriffs. The state was so violent during the Reconstruction period that a congressional committee report documented over 900 murders in just 3 years. The Wild West had 4 overlapping systems of law enforcement, though calling them that is generous. Federal marshals were the representatives of the United States government, but there were pitifully few of them. Their primary job wasn't protecting citizens, it was guarding federal buildings, courthouses, and tracking the most dangerous fugitives who crossed state lines. A single marshal might be responsible for a territory larger than several European countries. Most settlers would never see a federal lawman in their entire lives. County sheriffs were elected officials, which created a perverse incentive structure. To win votes, a candidate needed to be popular. To keep the peace in a town full of armed drunk cowboys and desperate criminals, a sheriff needed to be terrifying. The solution was that towns often elected former outlaws, gunfighters, and killers to wear the badge. If you were going to have a violent psychopath in your community, the logic went, better to have him working for you than against you. Bounty hunters operated in a moral gray zone between legal and criminal. They tracked wanted men for the reward money posted on their heads. Some were former lawmen. Others were former outlaws. The line between the two was thin enough to be invisible. From this chaotic profession emerged the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which became America's largest private law enforcement organization. It was essentially a corporate army that worked for the highest bidder, and often used methods that would make modern police departments blush. Lynch mobs were the most common and most effective form of frontier justice. When a crime occurred, local residents would simply grab the suspect, hold an impromptu trial, often lasting minutes, and hang him from the nearest tree. These were not always cases of angry mobs seeking revenge. Some communities had organized vigilance committees that functioned as semi-official parallel governments. They kept detailed records, held votes, and even issued receipts for confiscated property. The macabre efficiency of lynch law was staggering. In Los Angeles County during the 1850s, vigilante committees executed almost as many people as the official court system. Historian Hubert Howe Bancroft documented that, in Montana Territory alone, vigilantes hanged at least 31 men between 1863 and 1865. The most disturbing fact is that the United States federal government did not make lynching a federal crime until 2022, 157 years after the Civil War ended. Picture the classic Western gunfight. A saloon goes quiet. Two men stand at opposite ends of the room. Their eyes lock. Hands hover over their holstered Colt revolvers. Then, in a blur of motion, one man draws and fires in less than a second, his bullet finding its target with surgical precision. Every single element of this scene is wrong. Let's start with the weapons. The most common revolvers of the era, the Colt Navy 1851, the Colt Army 1860, and later the famous Colt Peacemaker of 1873, used black powder cartridges. When you fired one, it produced an enormous cloud of acrid smoke that immediately obscured your vision. Fire 2 or 3 shots in rapid succession, and you were essentially fighting blind, shooting at sounds and shadows in a choking gray fog. The guns themselves were wildly inaccurate by modern standards. A contemporary AR-15 rifle is roughly 7 to 8 times more accurate than the best revolvers of the 1870s. Hitting a man-sized target at 50 feet required genuine skill and a lot of luck. At 100 feet, you were basically throwing bullets in the general direction of your enemy and hoping. The weapons were also staggeringly unreliable. Misfires and mechanical failures were common enough to be considered normal. This is why experienced gunfighters carried 2 revolvers, not to fire them simultaneously like some ridiculous Hollywood action hero, but because when your first gun jammed, and it would, you needed a backup. As for the iconic low-slung holster on the hip, it is pure Hollywood invention, created in the 1920s for visual drama. Real frontier gunfighters stuffed their revolvers into their waistband, at the front of their body, or in their coat pockets. Why? Because they spent most of their time on horseback, and a gun hanging low on your thigh would bang painfully against the saddle with every stride. The quick draw itself is largely mythical. The average time to draw, cock, and fire a revolver was not the half-second shown in movies. It was closer to 1.5 seconds. Many men, trying to shave off fractions of a second, would cock the hammer while drawing, which meant they often pulled the trigger too early and shot themselves in the foot or knee. Literally. Wild Bill Hickok, the most famous gunfighter of his era, was not known for quick-draw duels. The closest thing to a duel he ever fought was against Davis Tutt in 1865. They did not stand in the street high noon style. Instead, both men took careful aim from about 75 yards away, roughly the length of a football field, standing sideways to minimize their silhouette, and fired deliberately. Hickok's bullet struck Tutt in the heart. Tutt's bullet went wide. That was considered exceptional marksmanship. Real frontier gunfights were drunken, chaotic brawls where the victor was usually the one who shot first, often from behind, brought more friends, or simply got lucky. The romantic notion of the fair fight was as fictional as the unicorn. The kill counts attributed to famous gunfighters are equally exaggerated. Wild Bill Hickok, supposedly the deadliest shooter of his generation, killed only 6 men in his entire life, and most of those were in wartime combat. Bat Masterson, another frontier legend, killed 2. Doc Holliday killed perhaps 3 or 4. The average lifespan of a professional gunfighter was 35 years. That wasn't because they all died in glorious duels. Most were shot in the back, ambushed while drunk, or hanged by angry mobs. On February 13, 1866, in the peaceful town of Liberty, Missouri, a group of men rode into town at mid-morning. They wore fine clothes and moved with military precision. Splitting into smaller groups, they casually chatted with locals while positioning themselves around the Clay County Savings Association building. Then, with sudden violence, several men burst into the bank with revolvers drawn. Within minutes, they had stuffed $60,000 worth of cash, gold, and bonds into sacks and were galloping out of town. As they fled, they shot and killed George Y. Moore, a 19-year-old college student who happened to be walking down the street. This was the first successful daylight bank robbery in American history during peacetime. The men who committed it were the James Younger Gang, and their leader, though he was not present that day due to a war wound, was Jesse Woodson James. Jesse's transformation from small-town Missouri boy to America's most notorious outlaw reads like a Greek tragedy. Born in 1847 to a preacher father and a strong-willed mother named Zerelda, young Jesse seemed destined for respectability. His family owned a prosperous estate. Then came the Civil War. Jesse's older brother Frank joined the Confederate Army at 18. 14-year-old Jesse stayed home with his mother and stepfather, Dr. Reuben Samuel, a wealthy physician. When Union troops conducting a sweep for Confederate sympathizers arrived at the Samuel estate, they hanged the doctor from a tree. He survived, brutally beat young Jesse nearly to death, and burned the house to the ground. When he recovered, Jesse did what any traumatized, rage-filled teenager would do. He went to war. He joined the most savage partisan unit in the Confederacy, Quantrill's Raiders, later operating under the even more brutal Bloody Bill Anderson. These were not conventional soldiers. They were essentially terrorists who operated behind Union lines, scalping their enemies and decorating their saddles with human hair. In August 1863, they burned the entire town of Lawrence, Kansas, to the ground, executing more than 150 unarmed civilians, including children. Jesse James was 16 years old at the time. When the war ended, most Confederate soldiers received pardons and went home. Quantrill's Raiders were different. They were explicitly excluded from amnesty. As Jesse rode home with a white flag, a Union soldier shot him through the lung. He nearly died. He was now a wounded, traumatized veteran with no education, no trade, and no legal path to a normal life. Becoming an outlaw wasn't really a choice. It was his only option. The James Younger Gang distinguished itself from typical frontier bandits in several ways. They had military discipline. Before a job, they trained extensively. Jesse once spent weeks teaching his horse to stand perfectly still while he practiced running and vaulting into the saddle. Their weapons and equipment were immaculate. They planned escape routes with multiple contingencies. And they were unfailingly polite during robberies. They called their victims Sir and Ma'am. They made jokes. They paid for food and lodging when they stopped at farmhouses. When finished, they would tip their hats and thank everyone for their cooperation. Then they would put a bullet in anyone who resisted. Jesse's greatest advantage wasn't his gun, it was his PR manager. John Newman Edwards, a former Confederate officer who became a powerful newspaper editor, essentially invented celebrity criminal journalism. He wrote florid editorials praising Jesse as a modern Robin Hood, driven to crime by Northern oppression, stealing from corrupt Yankee banks to help downtrodden Southerners. None of this was true. Jesse never gave money to the poor. But Edwards's articles were so persuasive that many people in Missouri genuinely believed Jesse was a folk hero. When lawmen came looking for him, locals would lie, hide him, or even take up arms to protect him. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by railroad and banking interests, became obsessed with capturing the James Gang. After repeated failures, Alan Pinkerton, the agency's founder, snapped. On the night of January 25, 1875, a squad of Pinkerton agents surrounded the Samuel family home. They threw an incendiary device, accounts vary between a firebomb and a flare, through the window. The explosion was devastating. Jesse's 9-year-old half-brother Archie was killed instantly, his body torn apart by shrapnel. Jesse's mother, Zerelda, had her right arm blown off below the elbow. She would wear the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of her life. Jesse wasn't even in the house. The American public was horrified. Newspapers across the country condemned the Pinkertons as child murderers and widow burners. Alan Pinkerton initially denied involvement, but documents uncovered later proved he personally ordered the raid. Nothing happened to him. He had too much money and too many political connections. The attack marked a turning point. Jesse became more paranoid, more violent, and more reckless. His carefully cultivated image as a gentleman bandit began to crack. The end came in Northfield, Minnesota, a small town populated largely by Swedish immigrants. On September 7, 1876, the James Younger gang rode in expecting an easy score. They were wrong. When the gang entered the First National Bank and demanded money, cashier Joseph Lee Haywood refused to open the safe. Even as they beat him savagely, he kept saying no. The townspeople, realizing what was happening, armed themselves with whatever they could find: hunting rifles, revolvers, axes, even rocks. What followed was a slaughter. The Swedes and Norwegians of Northfield, many of them Civil War veterans themselves, opened fire from every direction. One gang member was shot dead, his horse galloping in circles with his corpse still in the saddle, dead fingers locked around the reins. The younger brothers were shot to pieces. Bob took a bullet to the elbow. Jim had his jaw blown off. Cole was hit multiple times. Only Jesse and Frank escaped relatively unharmed. Everyone else died or was captured. The younger brothers each received 25-year prison sentences. Jim Younger committed suicide shortly after his release, unable to cope with his disfigurement and the modern world. Cole lived until 1916, touring with a Wild West show and telling sanitized versions of his criminal career to gawking audiences. Jesse rebuilt his gang with younger, more violent, more unstable men. The new crew lacked the discipline and intelligence of the original. The robberies became messier, bloodier. On April 3, 1882, Jesse was living under an assumed name in St. Joseph, Missouri, with his wife and children. He had invited 2 new gang members, brothers Charlie and Robert Ford, to his house to plan another robbery. While Zerelda James cooked breakfast in the kitchen and Jesse's children played outside, Jesse noticed a dusty picture frame hanging on the wall. He pulled up a chair to wipe it down. Robert Ford drew his revolver and shot Jesse James in the back of the head. The Ford brothers expected a hero's welcome. They received a $10,000 reward and a full pardon from the governor. But the American public, who had been reading about the martyred rebel Jesse James for 16 years, turned on them with fury. Robert Ford became known nationwide as the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard, Howard being Jesse's alias. Songs were written about Ford's cowardice. Parents named him as a villain in bedtime stories. He couldn't escape the stigma. He fled to Colorado and opened a saloon, where he became a tourist attraction. People would pay to gawk at the man who killed Jesse James. In 1892, a nobody gunslinger named Edward O'Kelly walked into Ford's saloon and shot him with a shotgun, believing it would make him famous. It didn't. O'Kelly died in obscurity. But Ford's last word, spoken as he lay dying, was reportedly, Jesse. James Butler. Wild Bill Hickok was destroyed by the world's first viral fake news story. Born in 1837 in rural Illinois, Hickok grew up religious, well-mannered, and physically imposing, over 6 feet tall with flowing hair and a handlebar mustache that would become his trademark. During the Civil War, he served the Union as a scout and spy, operating behind Confederate lines. He was brave, resourceful, and genuinely skilled with firearms. In December 1865, he became involved in perhaps the only real duel of the Western era. A man named Davis Tutt, angry over a gambling debt, and a woman they both loved, publicly humiliated Hickok by taking his pocket watch. Hickok warned him to return it. Tutt refused and showed up in the town square wearing the watch as a taunt. They stood approximately 75 yards apart. Both drew, turned sideways, took careful aim, and fired. Hickok's bullet struck Tutt in the heart. Tutt's bullet went wide. Tutt walked a few steps, said, "Boys, I'm killed," and collapsed. Hickok was arrested and tried for manslaughter. He was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense in a fair fight, one of the only times a Western jury ever recognized such a concept. That single gunfight should have been a footnote in Hickok's life. Instead, it destroyed him. In February 1867, a journalist named George Ward Nichols published a sensationalized interview with Hickok in Harper's New Monthly Magazine, one of America's most widely read publications. In it, Nichols claimed Hickok had killed hundreds of men with his own hands. The article described impossible feats, Hickok supposedly jumping his horse onto a billiard table inside a saloon, then leaping back out through the door, a distance of roughly 50 feet. It described him holding off an angry mob of 50 armed men single-handedly. None of it was true. At the time, Hickok had perhaps killed 5 or 6 men, mostly in wartime combat, but the article made him a national celebrity overnight. Hickok initially found this hilarious. When subsequent journalists came asking for stories, he would spin increasingly ridiculous yarns, seeing how much he could get them to believe. He told one reporter he had killed over 100 men. He told another he could shoot the eye out of a crow at 100 yards. The reporters dutifully published every word. The joke stopped being funny when young men started hunting him. Across the West, would-be gunslingers decided the best way to make a name for themselves was to kill Wild Bill Hickok. He couldn't go into a saloon without some drunk kid challenging him. He developed severe paranoia. He slept with newspapers spread around his bed so he would hear approaching footsteps. He always sat with his back to the wall in any room, obsessively watching the door. In 1871, while serving as Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, Hickok faced his greatest nightmare. A group of drunk cowboys started shooting up the Alamo Saloon. Hickok went to stop them and ended up in a gunfight with Phil Coe, a gambler who had been causing trouble. In the chaos, in the darkness and gun smoke, Hickok saw another man running toward him with a gun drawn. He fired on instinct. The man fell dead. It was Mike Williams, Hickok's own deputy and close friend, who had been running to help him. Witnesses said Hickok's face went white. He picked up Williams's body and carried it through the streets, sobbing openly, not caring who saw. He paid for the funeral out of his own pocket and wrote to Williams's widow. Wild Bill Hickok never killed another person after that night. He quit as marshal and drifted, trying unsuccessfully to escape his reputation. He joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, but hated performing. The big eastern cities made him miserable. In 1876, he found himself in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, an illegal gold mining camp built on stolen Lakota land. He was nearly blind from glaucoma, drinking heavily, and desperately trying to win enough money gambling to retire. On August 2, 1876, Hickok entered saloon number 10 to play poker. Usually, he insisted on a seat with his back to the wall. But that day, his usual spot was taken. After asking several times to trade seats and being refused, he broke his cardinal rule and sat with his back to the door. A 25-year-old petty criminal named Jack McCall walked in. McCall had lost money to Hickok the previous day. Emboldened by whiskey and wounded pride, he pulled out a revolver, walked up behind Hickok, and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range. Wild Bill Hickok, the man newspapers claimed had killed hundreds, died without even seeing his killer. The bullet passed through his brain and struck another player in the wrist. Hickok's body slumped forward onto the card table. In his hand were 2 black aces, 2 black eights, and the jack of diamonds. That poker hand became known as the dead man's hand, a symbol of death that appears in Western films to this day. McCall was captured immediately. The town held a trial in the local theater building. In a decision that perfectly captures the lawlessness of Deadwood, the jury acquitted him, and he fled. Unfortunately for McCall, he ran to Wyoming Territory, where federal authorities pointed out that Deadwood, being illegal, had no legal standing to hold trials. So they held another one and hanged him. Robert Leroy Parker, who the world would know as Butch Cassidy, was a different breed of outlaw. He was essentially the frontier's first white-collar criminal, a strategic thinker who approached bank robbery like a business operation. Born in 1866 to devout Mormon parents in Utah, young Roy, his family nickname, seemed destined for honest work. At 13, he took a job at a ranch where he met a cattle rustler named Mike Cassidy. The older man became his mentor, teaching him to shoot, ride, and steal livestock. Roy adopted his mentor's surname and his profession. Butch came later, from a job he held at a butcher shop. What set Cassidy apart wasn't violence. He actively avoided killing, but meticulous planning. Before his first major bank job in 1889, he spent weeks training his horse to remain calm while he practiced running up and leaping into the saddle at full speed. He scouted escape routes, planted fresh horses at specific points, and memorized every detail of the target. His gang, which newspapers would dub the Wild Bunch, perfected the art of the getaway. They operated like modern terrorists, fast, coordinated, and disciplined. Between 1896 and 1901, they pulled off 9 major robberies, 4 banks, 4 trains, and 1 mining company payroll office. Average take, $30,000 per job, over $1 million in today's money. Cassidy's genius was operational security. Between jobs, he would vanish, often by taking legitimate work on ranches or farms. Who would look for a successful bank robber among sweaty farmhands making $1 a day? The Winnemucca bank robbery in Nevada, September 1900, showcased Cassidy's methods. For weeks before, the gang posed as cattle drivers, drinking in the saloon directly across from the bank. They were friendly, generous with money, and especially kind to local children, buying them candy, letting them ride the horses, telling stories around campfires. What the children didn't realize was that they were being pumped for information about the bank's routines, the guard's schedule, which lawmen were in town. On September 19, the gang walked into the saloon for their usual morning whiskey. Then they crossed the street, entered the bank, and politely announced, "Gentlemen, raise your hands." They left with $32,640 in gold coins, more than enough to fund Cassidy's dream of going straight. As they fled, they stopped at a ranch to swap horses. By bitter irony, the ranch was owned by the same financier whose bank they had just robbed, But they also left behind Cassidy's distinctive white horse, with instructions to give it to a specific 10-year-old boy Cassidy had befriended. The boy received the horse as promised. Decades later, as an old man, he would tell reporters, "A man who keeps his word to a child can't be all bad." Cassidy understood something other outlaws didn't. Their era was ending. The frontier was closing. Telegraph lines meant that descriptions of wanted men traveled faster than horses. Barbed wire, invented in 1874, had carved the open range into private property. The railroad companies had hired the Pinkerton Agency, which now had hundreds of agents and effectively unlimited resources. After the Nevada job, Cassidy and his partner Harry Sundance Kid Longabaugh took their girlfriends and fled to South America. They bought a ranch in Cholula, Argentina, and tried to live as respectable ranchers. The Pinkertons found them anyway. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts say Cassidy and Sundance were killed by Bolivian soldiers in 1908 during a shootout. Other evidence suggests they escaped, returned to the United States under assumed names, and died peacefully of old age. The uncertainty is fitting. The Wild West had always been more myth than reality, a place where the line between hero and villain, law and lawlessness, truth and legend was permanently blurred. The Wild West existed for roughly 50 years, from about 1850 to 1900. In that time, it produced a few dozen famous outlaws, perhaps 100 recorded gunfights, and killed thousands of people in ways both spectacular and mundane. Hollywood has been making movies about it for over a century. Why does this brief, brutal period hold such power over our imagination? Perhaps because the myth serves a purpose that reality never could. We don't want to know that most gunfighters died of dysentery or were shot in the back while drunk. We don't want to hear that Jesse James was probably a traumatized veteran with PTSD, that Wild Bill Hickok died because of a journalist's lies, or that the heroic lawmen were often former criminals. We want the version where problems can be solved with a fast draw and a steady hand, where right and wrong are as clear as the line between white hats and black hats, where a lone individual can stand up against corruption and win through sheer courage. The real Wild West offered none of that comfort. It was messy, cruel, and often pointless. People killed and died for livestock, poker debts, and perceived slights. Justice was arbitrary. The average man lived in poverty and fear. But in its place, we built something more valuable than truth. A national mythology that tells us who we want to be, even if it has nothing to do with who we were. The fastest gun never existed, but we needed him anyway.